old Cowboy against 300 wolves to save his ranch. No one believed him until morning. Silas Merrick stood in the town square with dirt on his boots and desperation in his voice, warning anyone who would listen that the wolves were coming, not a dozen, not 50, but hundreds driven by something that had emptied the forests and left entire herds scattered across the valley floor. The men laughed. The women shook their heads. Curtis Brennan called him a fool who spent too many years alone on that failing ranch, talking to shadows and seeing threats where none existed. But Silas had seen the tracks that went on for half a mile in both directions, crisscrossing paths worn deep into frozen ground by paws that moved with purpose. By the time the sun set that evening and the first howls drifted across the empty plains toward his isolated property, everyone else was asleep in their warm beds, doors locked against cold, and nothing more. Silas loaded his rifle with hands that hadn't shaken in 40 years, and waited. 3 days earlier, he noticed the silence first, the kind of silence that meant every living thing with sense had already fled. His cattle huddled near the barn instead of grazing the east pasture. The ravens that usually circled overhead were gone. Even the coyotes that yipped at dusk had vanished, leaving behind only the wind moving through dead grass and the creak of wood settling in the cold. Silas rode to the Brennan place first, 20 miles south where Curtis kept 200 head and employed 3 men year-round. Curtis met him at the fence line, arms crossed, already annoyed before Silas opened his mouth. "Got something migrating through," Silas said, keeping his voice level. "Big pack. Maybe more than a pack. Tracks suggest they're moving coordinated, hunting in a pattern I haven't seen before." Curtis spat into the dirt. "Winter always brings wolves down from the high country, old man. That's nature. Nothing new. This isn't high country wolves. The tracks came from the west, from open territory, and there's too many of them." "How many?" "More than I could count before the wind covered them." Curtis laughed a short, dismissive bark. "You want me to pull my men off work because you saw some dog prints? Silas, you're losing your edge. Time was, you could tell the difference between a threat and a Tuesday." Silas tightened his grip on the reins. "I'm telling you what I saw, and I'm telling you to go home and rest. You've been alone too long." He tried Ida Hawthorne at the trading post, showed her the sketch he made of the track pattern. She barely glanced at it. He found Owen Talbot mending fence near the creek and spent 20 minutes explaining what empty dens and scattered kill sites meant. Owen nodded politely, but his eyes said he thought Silas was chasing ghosts. By evening of that third day, Silas rode back to his ranch under a sky going gray and cold. The warnings hadn't worked. No one was coming to help. No one believed him. He stabled his horse, checked the barn doors twice, carried every spare lantern to the porch and counted his ammunition. 43 rounds for the rifle, a dozen for the revolver, 2 boxes of shells he'd been saving for spring. It would have to be enough. The first howl came just after dark, a single voice testing the air, then another, and another. Within minutes the sound multiplied, echoing off the hills and surrounding his property from every direction. Silas stepped onto the porch and looked out across land he'd worked for 30 years. The moonlight caught their eyes first, hundreds of them, moving like a single breathing shadow, closing the distance with terrifying coordination. They weren't hunting randomly. They were executing a plan. Silas raised the rifle and waited for them to come into range. Because what no one understood, what Curtis and Ida and all the others had failed to grasp when they laughed at his warnings, was that Silas Merrick hadn't spent 40 years on this land without learning how to protect it. And tonight he was going to show them exactly what that meant. The first wave came fast, 30 or 40 animals breaking from the main group and rushing the porch in a coordinated charge that would have overwhelmed anyone unprepared. Silas fired 3 shots in rapid succession, each bullet finding its mark and dropping a wolf mid-stride. The others didn't scatter like normal predators would. They adjusted their approach, spreading wider, forcing him to choose targets while others closed the gap. He shot twice more, then fell back through the door and slammed it shut as bodies crashed against the wood. The impact shook the frame. Claws scraped at the boards. He moved to the window and fired through the gap, picking off 2 more before they retreated beyond range. The house went silent, except for his breathing and the creak of settling timber. Then the howling started again, not panicked or wild, but measured, calling to each other, regrouping. Silas reloaded and moved through the house, checking every window and door. The back entrance held firm. The shutters on the east side were latched. He grabbed a lantern and hung it near the front window where the light would give him visibility while keeping him in shadow. The wolves circled the property in small groups, testing the perimeter, watching for weakness. This wasn't normal pack behavior. Normal packs hunted prey that ran. They used exhaustion and confusion. These animals moved with military precision-probing defenses, adapting to resistance, operating with a level of intelligence that turned his stomach cold. He thought about the tracks he'd seen 3 days ago, the way they converged from multiple directions but never crossed randomly. The kill sites he'd found stripped clean with nothing wasted. The abandoned dens, not destroyed but simply left behind as if whatever lived there decided to move on together. Something had organized them, not magic or spirits. Silas didn't believe in such nonsense, but starvation and desperation turned animals into something different. When prey disappeared and territory dried up, creatures adapted or died. These wolves had adapted by becoming something more dangerous than nature intended. A crash from the barn made him spin toward the sound. They were trying the livestock. He heard his horse scream a sound that cut through the night and told him exactly what was happening. If they got into the barn and killed the animals, they'd stay. They'd have food and shelter and no reason to leave. The ranch would become their hunting ground. Silas grabbed the revolver and moved to the back door. He couldn't let them take the barn, couldn't let them establish control. But opening that door meant exposing himself to hundreds of predators who had already proven they could coordinate attacks. He counted to 3, threw the door open, and fired 4 shots toward the barn entrance where shadows moved in masses too thick to be individual animals. Something yelped. Others snarled. His horse kicked at the stall door. Panicked but still alive, Silas slammed the door shut and pressed his back against it as bodies hit the wood from outside. They'd anticipated his move, waited for him to expose himself. Now they knew he'd defend the barn, which meant they knew his weakness. The scratching at the door intensified. More wolves joined, and Silas felt the hinges strain under the weight of dozens of bodies pressing forward. The door wouldn't hold if they committed fully to breaking through. He had 40 rounds left, and 300 wolves surrounding his property. The night was just beginning, and somewhere in the darkness, the pack was learning. The door held for 3 minutes before the first crack appeared in the lower panel. Silas wedged a chair against it and retreated to the center of the room where he could see both entrances. The scratching stopped. The pressure eased. They pulled back again, and that worried him more than the direct assault. He moved to the front window and looked out across the yard. The wolves had reorganized into 3 distinct groups, one holding position near the barn, another spread across the western approach, and the largest mass circling to the north where the land sloped toward the creek. They were cutting off escape routes, ensuring he stayed trapped. Silas had seen desperate animals before, watched a mountain lion stalk the same failing deer for 2 days because nothing else was available, observed coyotes dig through frozen ground for hours to reach a buried carcass. Desperation made predators bold, but it didn't make them tactical, unless the desperation was collective, unless an entire population faced extinction simultaneously, and survival meant evolving past individual instinct into something that looked like strategy. He thought about the empty forests, the abandoned territories. Whatever had driven these wolves from their normal range hadn't been gradual, it had been catastrophic. A fire, maybe, or disease that wiped out the prey animals. Something that forced hundreds of predators into the same desperate conclusion: move together or starve alone. The moon shifted position, and in the new light, Silas saw what he'd missed before. Not all the wolves were healthy. Many showed visible ribs, some moved with limps or favored injured legs. These weren't apex predators at their peak. They were refugees driven by hunger so severe it had stripped away every natural caution, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. A wolf broke from the northern group and sprinted toward the house, testing his reaction time. Silas tracked it through the window but didn't fire. Wasting ammunition on scouts would leave him defenseless when they committed to a real assault. The wolf veered away at the last second and rejoined the pack. They were learning his patterns, measuring his responses. Every action he took gave them information, and they were adapting faster than he'd anticipated. The barn went quiet. His horse had stopped kicking, which meant either the animal had calmed or exhausted itself. Silas couldn't check without exposing himself, and the wolves knew that. They'd created a situation where his choices were limited, and every option carried risk. He lit a second lantern and placed it near the back door, then returned to his position at the front window. The additional light might discourage them or it might attract attention. Either way, he needed visibility to fight effectively. A new sound emerged from the darkness, low and rhythmic. Not howling, but something between a growl and a vocalization. The entire pack took it up, creating a wall of noise that pressed against the house from every direction. The sound didn't stop, didn't vary, just continued in that same unsettling cadence that worked its way into his chest and made his heart match the rhythm. Silas recognized the tactic. He'd used it himself 40 years ago in a different kind of war. Psychological pressure. Break the enemy's nerve before the real attack begins. Make them panic. Make them make mistakes. But Silas Merrick hadn't survived 4 decades on this land by panicking. He checked his ammunition one more time, adjusted his position, and waited. The wolves were learning, but so was he. And when morning came, only one side would still be standing. The rhythmic growling stopped at midnight. Complete silence followed, the kind that made every creak of the house sound like breaking bone. Silas knew what came next. He'd used silence as a weapon before, back when he wore a different uniform and fought in wars that newspapers barely mentioned. The quiet before an assault was designed to fray nerves and create uncertainty. Make the defender guess. Make him move first. He stayed motionless at the window, rifle ready, breathing controlled. His back ached from standing. His legs protested the stillness. But movement meant silhouette, and silhouette meant target. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. The western group hit the shuttered window with enough force to crack wood. The northern pack rushed the front porch in a mass that sounded like thunder. And something, he couldn't see what, crashed against the barn with sustained impact that told him they were trying to collapse the structure entirely. Silas fired through the front window, dropping 2 wolves before the rest scattered. He spun toward the western wall where claws had broken through the shutter and were widening the gap. One shot through the opening made them retreat. The barn continued taking punishment, and his horse screamed again, high and terrified. He had to make a choice: defend the house completely and lose the barn, or risk everything to drive them away from the livestock. Either option was a gamble with his life as the stake. Curtis Brennan had called him foolish for living alone at his age. Said a man past 60 shouldn't be working a ranch without help, without family, without anyone to rely on when things went wrong. Curtis didn't know that Silas had been alone most of his life by choice, not circumstance. Trust was a luxury he'd lost 30 years ago when the men he commanded didn't come home from a valley that wasn't supposed to see combat. He'd made the wrong call then, read the situation incorrectly, sent 12 men into an ambush because he believed reconnaissance that turned out to be false. 6 came back. The other 6 stayed in that valley, and their families stayed in his memory faces at funerals. Voices that called him a fool who got good men slaughtered. After that, people stopped listening when he warned about danger, stopped believing his assessments, figured if he'd been wrong once about something that mattered, he'd be wrong again. So when he came to them 3 days ago talking about wolves and coordinated threats, they heard the same old fool who'd made the worst mistake of his life and never quite recovered. But Silas had learned from that valley, learned that hesitation killed and certainty was a lie, learned that you couldn't save everything, but you could choose what mattered most and defend it without compromise. He grabbed the lantern and moved to the back door, opened it fast and threw the lit lantern toward the barn entrance. Glass shattered, oil ignited, flames spread across dry wood and caught the nearest wolves in a wave of fire that sent them scattering with burned fur and panicked yelps. The pack retreated from the barn. Silas fired 3 more shots into the mass, then slammed the door shut and braced for retaliation. They'd come for him now, all of them, because he'd hurt them, and desperate animals didn't forgive pain. The entire north side of the house erupted with impacts, dozens of bodies hitting wood simultaneously. The door frame splintered, windows cracked, the roof groaned under weight that shouldn't exist. Silas fell back to the center room and aimed at the door. 33 rounds left, maybe 200 wolves still alive, and the night was only half over. The front door broke inward at 2 in the morning. Silas fired twice into the opening and kicked a cabinet across the gap to slow the flood of bodies trying to force their way through. Teeth snapped inches from his leg. Claws raked the wood. He shot again, and the cabinet held just long enough for him to retreat up the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor. His lungs burned. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. Blood ran down his left arm where something had torn through his sleeve during the chaos, not deep enough to stop him, but deep enough to remind him he was 70 pounds lighter and 40 years older than the last time he'd fought for survival like this. The wolves poured into the house. He heard them below, knocking over furniture. Searching. They'd won the ground floor. Now they owned half his defensive position, and he was trapped on the upper level with limited ammunition and no way out except through them. Silas moved to the bedroom window that faced east. The sky showed the faintest hint of gray, not dawn yet, but close. 3 hours, maybe 4. If he could hold that long, sunrise would change everything. Predators didn't like fighting in full light. They'd retreat to shadows and cover, give him breathing room. But 3 hours might as well be 3 days with wolves in his house and his strength fading. He wedged the bedroom door shut with a dresser and checked his ammunition. 28 rounds. He'd rationed carefully, but defending from 2 levels meant twice the exposure and twice the opportunities for them to overwhelm him. Something heavy hit the door from below. Then again. They were testing the ceiling, looking for weak points. The floorboards in the hallway were old, 40 years of wear and weather damage. If they focused pressure on the right spot, they could break through. Silas grabbed the remaining lanterns and lined them along the bedroom wall. He tore strips from the bedding and soaked them in lamp oil. When the door started splintering, he'd have one option left, the same option that had saved his men in that valley 3 decades ago when retreat wasn't possible, and surrender meant dying. You didn't beat an enemy with superior numbers. You changed the battlefield until numbers didn't matter. The door cracked. Wood splintered. A wolf's head pushed through the gap, and Silas shot it point blank. The body fell back, but 3 more took its place, widening the opening with raw determination. He lit the oil-soaked cloth and threw it down the stairs. Flames caught immediately, spreading across the floor where lamp oil had pooled. The wolves in the stairwell retreated, but the fire blocked their advance and his escape equally. Smoke filled the house within minutes, thick and black and suffocating. Silas wrapped cloth around his face and stayed low where the air was clearer. The wolves on the ground floor fled through the broken door and windows, driven out by flames they couldn't fight. But the fire didn't discriminate. It consumed everything, the furniture, the walls, the memories of 30 years lived in rooms that were now turning to ash. Silas had saved the barn by sacrificing the house, saved his life by destroying his home. He climbed out the bedroom window onto the porch roof, as flames licked through the floorboards behind him. The remaining wolves circled below, watching, waiting. Fewer now, maybe 100. The others had scattered or died or simply given up. Silas raised his rifle. 24 rounds left. The sky was lighter now. Dawn was coming, and when it arrived, everyone who'd called him a fool would see the truth written across his burned land and the bodies of wolves that had dared to test whether an old man still knew how to fight. The roof shingles bit into Silas's knees as he crouched near the edge. Rifle aimed at the mass of wolves circling below. Smoke poured from the windows behind him, and heat pressed against his back like a living thing. The house groaned, support beams weakening, structure failing. He had minutes before the entire building collapsed and took him with it. The wolves sensed his vulnerability. They'd stopped their coordinated attacks and now simply waited, spread in a loose ring around the property, conserving energy, letting the fire do their work. Smart enough to know that gravity and flames would finish what teeth couldn't. Silas's left arm throbbed where the gash ran from shoulder to elbow. His vision blurred at the edges from smoke inhalation. Every breath felt like swallowing glass. He was 67 years old, bleeding, exhausted, and trapped on a burning building with predators below waiting for him to fall. The eastern sky shifted from gray to pale orange. First light. Not full dawn, but close. Another 30 minutes and the sun would break the horizon, flooding the valley with the kind of brightness that sent nocturnal hunters into cover. If he could last 30 minutes. A section of roof near the chimney collapsed inward with a crash that sent sparks spiraling into the air. The structure shuddered. Silas scrambled toward the western edge where the porch roof extended over the side entrance lower, but still 8 feet above ground. He could survive the drop. Probably. But landing in the middle of a wolf pack meant dying slower than falling through burning timber. One of the larger wolves broke from the group and approached the house. Testing. Silas tracked it with the rifle but held fire. Ammunition was precious. Every wasted shot reduced his chances of fighting through to the barn where he could barricade himself behind heavier walls. The wolf stopped 10 feet from the house and stared up at him. Just stared. Not aggressive, not retreating. Calculating. The animal's ribs showed through matted fur. Blood crusted around its muzzle from earlier fighting. It looked as exhausted as Silas felt. 2 survivors of the same brutal night, both too stubborn to quit. Behind him, more roof collapsed. The heat intensified. He couldn't stay here. Silas made the choice. He dropped from the porch roof, landed hard on his good shoulder, rolled, and came up firing. 2 shots dropped the nearest wolves. The pack surged forward, and he ran not toward safety, but toward the only place left to defend. The barn doors hung open where he'd thrown the lantern hours earlier. Scorch marks blackened the entrance, but the structure stood intact. His horse whinnied from inside, somehow still alive. Silas dove through the opening and spun to face the pursuing wolves. They hit the doorway in a mass of fur and teeth. He fired 4 times in rapid succession, creating a barrier of bodies that slowed the ones behind. Then he slammed the barn door shut and dropped the heavy crossbar into place. Impact after impact shook the doors. Wood creaked but held. The barn had been built to withstand storms and years. It would hold against wolves if he gave it help. Silas grabbed tools from the wall and wedged them against the door as additional bracing. Pitchforks, shovels, anything that added resistance. The attacks lessened. The wolves were tiring, and through the gaps in the barn walls, Silas saw what they saw, the eastern horizon blazing gold as the sun finally cleared the hills. Morning had arrived. The night was over, and Silas Merrick was still breathing. Sunlight poured through the barn walls in golden shafts that turned dust into floating stars. Silas leaned against a support beam and watched through the gaps as the wolves retreated. Not running, they were too exhausted for that, but withdrawing in small groups, moving back toward the hills with the defeated posture of an army that had lost more than it gained. He counted bodies in the yard. 43 wolves lay dead or dying within view. More scattered across the property beyond his sight line. The house burned down to its foundation, sending up columns of black smoke visible for miles. The ground around the barn was torn and bloody, marked with tracks so numerous they overlapped into meaningless patterns. Physical evidence, undeniable proof. The kind of proof that men like Curtis Brennan couldn't laugh away or dismiss as the ravings of a lonely old fool. Silas's horse shifted in the stall behind him, nervous but unharmed. He'd saved the animal, saved the barn, lost his home but kept his land. The balance seemed fair, given the alternative was losing everything, including his life. His arm had stopped bleeding but hurt with the kind of deep ache that meant infection if he didn't clean it properly. His ribs protested every breath from where he'd landed coming off the roof. Smoke damage had left his throat raw, but he was alive, still standing, still capable of defending what was his. The sound of horses reached him before he saw the multiple riders approaching from the south at a speed that suggested urgency. Silas pushed away from the beam and moved to the barn door, listening. Voices carried across the open ground. "Sweet mercy, Curtis. Look at this." That was Owen Talbot, young and shocked. "The whole house is gone. Think he made it out?" Ida Hawthorne, practical even in crisis. "Probably dead. Old fool stayed here alone when he should have." Curtis stopped mid-sentence. "What in God's name is that?" Silas lifted the crossbar and pushed the barn doors open. Sunlight hit him full in the face and he had to squint against the brightness. 3 riders sat motionless on their horses 30 yards away, staring at the carnage spread across his property. Curtis Brennan looked pale. Owen's mouth hung open. Ida's hand covered her lips. "Told you they were coming," Silas said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Told you 3 days ago." Curtis dismounted slowly, his eyes moving from the burned house to the dead wolves to Silas standing in the barn doorway with blood on his arm and soot on his face. "How many?" "Started with 300, maybe more. Lost count after the first wave." 300. Curtis repeated it like the words didn't make sense. "You fought 300 wolves. Alone. Wasn't much choice after nobody believed me." Owen climbed down from his horse and walked toward the nearest wolf carcass. Stopped a few feet away as if afraid it might still be dangerous. "I've never seen this many in one place. Never heard of anything like this." "They were starving," Silas said. "Driven out of their territory by something that killed their prey. Became organized because they had to. Nature doesn't care about what's normal when survival is at stake." Ida guided her horse closer, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "You should be dead." "Should be. Am not." Curtis walked through the yard, counting bodies, examining tracks, touching burned wood where the house had stood. When he finally turned back to face Silas, something had changed in his expression. The dismissiveness was gone, the easy mockery absent. "I called you a fool," Curtis said quietly. "Said you were losing your edge. Sent you away when you came for help. You did. I was wrong." Silas nodded once. "You were, but you're here now. That counts for something." Ida brought medical supplies from her saddlebag and cleaned the gash on Silas's arm, while Owen and Curtis walked the property, documenting what they found. The wound was deep but clean, no infection yet, though it would scar. She wrapped it tight with cloth and told him he needed proper stitching from someone with steadier hands and better light. "You'll live," she said, standing back to examine her work, "though I can't figure how." "Stubbornness," Silas replied, "and knowing when to burn what can't be saved." More riders arrived within the hour. Word had spread through the valley about smoke visible from the southern ridges. Men came expecting to find remains and instead found a battlefield. They walked among the wolf carcasses with the kind of silence that meant they were recalculating everything they thought they knew about the old man who lived alone on failing land. Curtis organized crews to drag the dead wolves away from the barn and property. 43 bodies turned into 62 as they searched the surrounding areas. Owen found tracks leading north that suggested the survivors had scattered back into wilderness. Their coordinated pack structure broken by casualties and failure. "They won't come back," Owen said, returning from his scout. "Not after this. They learned you can't be taken." Silas sat on an overturned water trough and watched men work his land with efficiency he hadn't asked for but wouldn't refuse. His house was gone. Nothing salvageable except memories that existed only in his head now. The barn stood intact. His horse lived. The land remained his. It was enough. Curtis approached with a canteen and handed it over without speaking. Silas drank, tasting ash and smoke even through the clean water. "I owe you an apology that words can't cover," Curtis said finally. "You warned us. Rode to every ranch, every door. We called you a fool and sent you away. You did what made sense based on who you thought I was," Silas said. "Man who got soldiers lost because he read a situation wrong. Why trust him about wolves? Because you read this situation right. Saw what was coming when nobody else did. Stood your ground when running would have been smarter." Curtis gestured at the devastation. "This is what believing in yourself looks like when the whole world tells you you're wrong." Silas set the canteen down and looked at the burned foundation where his house had been. 30 years of living reduced to ash and stone. But the land underneath remained solid. The barn could be expanded. A smaller house built from what resources he had left. He'd started with less 40 years ago and made something worth defending. "I'll help you rebuild," Curtis said. "Won't ask permission. You need walls before winter and you can't raise them alone. Not after this." Others echoed the offer. Owen volunteered labor. Ida promised materials at cost. Men whose names Silas barely knew stepped forward with commitments of time and effort. Not charity restitution. Payment for the debt of disbelief that had nearly cost him everything. By noon, plans were forming. By afternoon, the first lumber was promised for delivery. By evening, Silas stood alone in the barn with his horse, looking out at land that had tested him and found him worthy. The wolves had come. 300 strong, organized and desperate and deadly. They'd destroyed his home and nearly taken his life. But when morning arrived and the sun burned away the darkness, Silas Merrick was still standing. And everyone who'd called him a fool had seen the proof written in blood and fire across the valley. No one would doubt him again. Not about wolves. Not about threats. Not about anything that mattered. He'd earned that through the longest night of his life, and it was enough. If you enjoyed this Wild West story of survival and courage, click the video on your screen right now to watch another incredible frontier tale. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories from the untamed American West. Hit that button and keep the adventure going.